As you know, by the largest democratic vote in British history, the British in 2016 voted to leave the European Union. Now, this upset a lot of people around the world, from Emmanuel Macron to Barack Obama. Macron, indeed, still refuses to treat Britain as a sovereign state and sees it rather like a renegade province of the EU, in much the same way as President Xi regards Taiwan as a renegade province of China. Inside Britain itself, there's a permanently alienated, embittered minority of Remainers who act as a cheerleading fifth column, really, for Brussels. A lot of these people are academics, of course, in the academic world is full of them. So as an academic addressing some academics here today, I feel a little bit like the Christian in ancient Rome who was thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. He was very worried, of course, about what was going to happen, so he went down on his knees and prayed to God to save him. But at that moment, a great lumbering beast of a lion came up and looked him over, and the Christian was so afraid. But the lion knelt down, and also, like the Christian, seemed to be assuming a praying position. The Christian threw his hands in the air and thanked God and shouted, oh Lord, I'm saved. This lion is also a Christian. At which point the lion said, do you want the good news or the bad news? And he said, the good news is you're quite right. I'm also a Christian. The bad news, unfortunately, is I'm only saying grace. Tonight, this afternoon rather, the bad news is that I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a historian, so I should be looking at Brexit from a historical perspective, beginning with a very long-term world historical perspective. Let me start with the European miracle. But I don't mean by that, of course, the European Union, which is a kind of European nightmare. But I'm talking about the European miracle as described in his wonderful book by Professor E.L. Jones. It's called The European Miracle. It's in its third edition as a Cambridge University Press paperback now. And the miracle he's referring to is a miracle that global historians talk about when they talk about the European miracle. That is the huge rise in prosperity of Europe between the years 1000 AD and 2000 AD. Because around the year 1000 AD, Europe, China, and the Middle East were all more or less at the same stage of development. But during the next 1,000 years, Europe surged ahead, overtaking all the rest of the world economically, politically, philosophically, and commercially. European GDP per capita grew 300-fold, personal income 13-fold. By 1820, the West had attained per capita income twice that of the rest of the world. By 2000, the per capita gap between the West and the rest had increased to 7 times. And by 2000, the West enjoyed average incomes 20 or 30 times greater than those of, say, sub-Saharan Africa. These figures come from a chapter in a book called Is There Still a West? By a distinguished American professor called Stephen Schucker. Schucker realizes that most of the initial advances were European. Roughly 80% of the world's chief intellectual and artistic accomplishments between 1400 and 1950 came from 4 areas alone: England, France, Germany, and Italy. Western Europe and its English-speaking offshoots were to become unique in developing free market, security of property, a predictable system of law, and parliamentary limitations on the exercise of power. Western Europe in the 16th century also experienced a scientific revolution that not merely discredited traditional authority, but also gave leaders in every field, from soil chemistry to political theory, the sense that they could master nature and improve on the wisdom of the ancients. Now, the key question, of course, for global historians was, why did this happen? Why did it come about? Well, according to Professor Jones and his school, the main reason is disunity. All these other parts of the world became empires. They became united as the Chinese Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire. They united, they were often bureaucratized, centralized, and were often mentally constricted by obeying a single state religion. But Europe never became an empire. The Holy Roman Empire, which had this potential, wasn't able to unite the continent. Christianity split between Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestantism, and later Protestantism split between various sects. So Europe became a state system, not a state. People could travel from one part to another. When Jews were thrown out of England, they could go to Spain. When Huguenots were thrown out of France, they could go to Prussia and to England. Intellectuals like Voltaire and Montesquieu could travel to England and then spread the word of parliamentary government and limited monarchy. Academies in the 17th and 18th centuries were set up and had competitions about the best way to reform states, comparing best practice in different European states. Peter the Great of Russia could lead a great embassy to the West to discover how to modernize Russia. Industrialists could spread railway construction from England to Belgium and to the continent. Lloyd George could send someone to Germany to find out what Bismarck had done about social insurance. So you have to think of this great burst of prosperity over 1,000 years in European history as being caused by the diversity and disunity of the continent. And you have to think of, if you like, a free market in states rather than a single state monopoly or empire called Europe. Of course, there were military differences between the powers, and so we have to consider what's called the European balance of power. Germans in particular these days seem to hate their very term. But in fact, the balance of power was absolutely crucial to securing European freedom and democracy. When one power or one ruler in Europe wanted to dominate the continent or unite the continent, Louis XIV, Napoleon, the Kaiser, Hitler, the European states under the balance of power formed coalitions against them. And these coalitions were mainly led and organized by Great Britain. And it's not an exaggeration to say that due to the British leadership against the would-be tyrants in Europe over centuries, European freedom and democracy is due to British independence. And British independence has secured European freedom more perhaps than anything else. Now, all of this is directly relevant, I'm happy to say, and you'll be happy to hear. All of this is directly relevant to Brexit and post-Brexit Europe today. For Brexit, this is startlingly clear already. For Brexit has allowed Great Britain to act independently and lead the opposition in Europe against Vladimir Putin in support of Ukraine, both militarily, diplomatically, and economically. Once again, she's taken the lead in the defense of freedom in Europe, whereas Germany and France have dragged their heels, attempting to negotiate a compromise settlement with Putin, not only before, but after his invasion of Ukraine, in order to impose terms on Zelensky that would deprive Ukraine of both territory and sovereignty. Only recently, indeed, the head of Volkswagen, Herbert Diess, has renewed the demand for a compromise peace brokered by the EU or imposed by the EU to get German and European exports to Russia moving again. French industry has been notably slow in moving out of Russia. The EU has still not managed to agree oil sanctions. Gas is only to be cut off by 2030. So outside the EU, Britain has regained her freedom due to Brexit to lead a coalition in a traditional style against Europe's enemies. Now, the implications of Brexit too have also been there economic. This whole sort of syndrome of diversity and disunity leading to growth also applies and to freedom. Also applies to economically, because it seems that the more the continent unites, centralizes, obeys the European idea, bureaucratizes, the less it grows. It's curious that since the since the EU introduced the internal market and the euro, its growth has suffered. These are the figures for the 20 years between 1997 and 2017. Eurozone growth between 1997 and 2017 was 26%. UK growth in the same period outside the Eurozone was 44%. US growth was 42%. Within that Eurozone figure, in 20 years, Italy grew by only 6.7%. Greece grew by only 1.3%. So one has to wonder whether an increasingly united Europe means a slowing down of European growth and perhaps the beginning of permanent decline. The curious fact is that this syndrome of European freedom and growth depending on diversity and disunity was seen as not only by Professor Jones in his school in this century, but was also remarked upon by others in the 19th century. Britain's greatest liberal, for example, John Stuart Mill, writing in his book On Representative Government, said the following: "What has made the European family of nations an improving instead of a stationary portion of mankind? Not only superior excellence in them, but their remarkable diversity of culture. Individuals, classes, nations have been extremely unlike one another. They have struck out a great variety of paths, each leading to something valuable. And although at every period they have been intolerant of one another, and each would have thought it an excellent thing if all the rest had been compelled to travel his road, each has in time endured to receive the good which others have offered. Europe is wholly indebted to this plurality of paths." And this quote from Mill comes from a wonderful book by the Israeli political scientist Yoram Hazony. It's Y-O-R-A-M-H-A-Z-O-N-Y, Yoram Hazony, and it's called The Virtue of Nationalism, and I recommend it. Well, let me now turn to Britain and Europe. Why did we join the EEC in the first place? Students sometimes think it was because we had lost our place in the world after 1945 and needed to regain prestige. But this is absolute nonsense. In 1962, when we first made a bid, we were the world's third power economically and militarily. The EEC states, in terms of geopolitics, by contrast, was simply a bunch of losers. France and the others had lost during the war, but France after the war had just lost two more wars, two bloody wars, one in Vietnam and then another in Algeria. And I hate to tell the French members of the audience, but in 1955, France was reduced to applying to join the British Commonwealth. And we turned her down. The Foreign Office said it didn't, the other members of the Commonwealth simply wouldn't understand. The other reason people think we joined the EC was because we were an economic basket case. But in 1973, our year of accession, British GDP grew by a record 7.4%. For the most part, of course, during the 60s and 70s, our average growth rate was generally lower than those of France and Germany. But this was due to two major economic problems. One was our massive overseas defense expenditure, including the British Army of the Rhine. And secondly, it was due to trade union militancy. Now, EU membership was irrelevant, absolutely irrelevant to both of these. It could do nothing about either. So we solved them ourselves. And then once we solved them by withdrawing from East of Suez and Thatcher reforming the trade unions, British growth then overtook EU and German growth. So why did we join? Sorry, there's a tweet there. So why did we join if it wasn't because of the reasons that most students suspect? Most people don't know this, but the answer is that when Harold Macmillan became Prime Minister, he was an out-and-out European federalist. And he and his sidekick, Edward Heath, were very close allies of Jean Monnet, whom they used to meet in secret. And indeed, under Edward Heath, the Tory party became a secret corporate member of Monnet's Action Committee for a United States of Europe. Douglas Hurd arranged for £15,000 to be paid to the Action Committee through Lord Edward Plowden's private account in the city. Maybe de Gaulle suspected this. In any case, he knew Macmillan was a close chum of President Kennedy, whose regime was also very close to Monnet, which it backed. So he vetoed British bids to join the EEC. And in his famous press conference, he asked, why would a country which had democratic institutions, nuclear weapons, and cheap food from the Commonwealth want to join an institution like the EEC? And it was a question that was never answered. But he wasn't having Macmillan in, and he turned to Macmillan after the veto and quoted Edith Piaf to him and said, "Ne pleurez pas, my lord." Still, Heath was determined to get us in, and when Pompidou was prepared to allow Britain to enter in order to counter Willy Brandt's rising Germany, Heath told his chief negotiator, Sir Conor Neil, to pay any price, including the surrender of our fishing grounds to the EEC, to gain entry. Sir Con used the slogan, "Swallow the lot, swallow it now," for his negotiations. This was not so much the diplomacy of Metternich, Bismarck, or Talleyrand, but that of Admiral Dönitz. Membership brought us neither influence or benefits. Food prices went up as we supported beef mountains and wine lakes. Our fishing resources were killed off, along with our fishing fleet and our fishing communities. And meanwhile, we paid billions of pounds every year to unelected foreign bureaucrats to devise laws designed to ruin us. Thatcher then won 2/3 of our money back in 1984 at Fontainebleau, but Delors later was to turn the trade unions and the Labour Party against her and was to advocate economic and monetary union. The idiot John Major then took us into the ERM, which proved an unmitigated disaster and cost us untold billions. And he then signed the Maastricht Treaty, making us all citizens of a united Europe. When asked what the obligations of citizenship were, his government simply couldn't explain. Well, by this time it was time to take back control, and in this I played my part. Having become a leading spokesman and pamphleteer for the Bruges Group, which under Mrs. Thatcher between 1989 and 91 became the country's leading think tank, I decided after her political assassination to maintain the pressure on the Conservative government by forming a new political party to oppose the Maastricht Treaty and indeed to oppose EU membership. In 1993, this was renamed the UK Independence Party. Now, originally under my leadership, it was a moderate mainstream party, and I led it as such until 1997. Thereafter, it fell under the baleful influence and leadership of Nigel Farage, who reorientated towards the extreme right with a new emphasis on immigration, even greater than the emphasis on quitting the EU. It now took up seats in the European Parliament, and it became the largest British political party in the European Parliament. But this didn't matter very much because British voters were supremely uninterested in the European Parliament. And by 2010, UKIP under Farage only received 3% of the vote of the poll and fewer than 1 million votes. UKIP should have disappeared. Farage should have disappeared. But he was saved by the Liberal Democrats, whose leader, Nick Clegg, joined a coalition with David Cameron, and this was politically suicidal. It was particularly suicidal because Clegg then agreed to triple student fees against a promise he had made to students, which were really his largest electorate. So UKIP then filled the gap as a protest party in British politics and put pressure on Cameron to have a referendum. Did UKIP cause Brexit then? Well, it played a part, but the final outcome of Brexit depended on the referendum campaign itself and on parliamentary manoeuvrings afterwards. And the referendum campaign was dominated by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. Farage and UKIP had little part to play in it, and arguably Farage lost as many votes for Brexit as he gained. But winning the referendum didn't mean achieving Brexit. All the parties, Lib Dems, Labour, SNP, Welsh Nats, all of course pledged to respect the vote, which after all was the largest democratic vote in British history. But once Theresa May lost a parliamentary majority in 2017, they all changed their minds. And then they all decided they wanted to stop Brexit and to prevent Brexit coming into being. And in this respect, the Lib Dems were the most contemptible. They were neither Liberal nor Democrat. They campaigned on slogans like "Bugger Brexit" and said they would reverse the referendum result without even a second referendum through a parliamentary vote. It would be just like France in 2005. You remember, you'll all know that France voted against the constitutional treaty in 2005, but it didn't make any difference because the constitutional treaty was suddenly changed into the Lisbon Treaty, which was then rammed through by a majority in the French Parliament. Anyways, this is what the Liberal Democrats tried to do. Starmer, the Labour spokesman for Europe, at least wanted to call a second referendum, something which he tried to get 48 different times. Eventually, there was a kind of second referendum on Brexit, the general election of 2019, which Boris won with a majority of 80. That Brexit survived at all was due, ironically, to the Liberal Democrats. Theresa May had struck a deal with Angela Merkel, which would have allowed the United Kingdom to leave the EU nominally, but to remain in the customs union and the internal market. This then was supposed to be ratified diplomatically with no vote in the House of Commons. But a rich Liberal Democrat called Gina Miller got the Liberal Democrat-dominated Supreme Court to rule out of concern for parliamentary sovereignty, which the Lib Dems had never heard of before, to rule that Parliament had to have the final say. So May's proposals were lost 3 times. So Brexit looked in limbo. It looked as if this Remain Parliament would veto Brexit, but that would require a new government. And the only possible government was one under Jeremy Corbyn, but the Lib Dems again refused to contemplate a Corbyn government. Instead, they put pressure on the inept Corbyn to have an election. And he agreed to the election in 2019, which of course had as a result that Boris swept the country, the rebels in the Tory party lost their seats, the Lib Dems were absolutely crushed, reduced to 11 MPs. Boris then agreed a bad deal with Brussels that retained free trade, but left Northern Ireland within the customs union. Whether he ever intended to stick to this deal, we don't know. But Northern Ireland will not accept it. Hence the crisis today of the Northern Irish Protocol, which governs it. Economically, Brexit seems to have made little difference, but politically, it is of absolute significance. We are once again a self-governing democracy with a government accountable only to ourselves and a government which alone makes British laws. And we, the British people, can throw out this government whenever we want at a general election. In short, we are a sovereign state. However, President Macron and most of the EU still seem to treat us as a renegade province. Nonetheless, Britain is now global Britain, with new independent defence treaties with Sweden and Finland, a new AUKUS pact with Australia and the United States, free trade treaties with Japan and 80 other countries. But despite all this, die-hard Remainers want to destroy both Brexit Britain and Boris, and they hope to do so either through Scottish independence or Irish unity. But this, again, is very unlikely to happen. The latest polls after 6 years of Brexit show that fewer than 30% of Scots want another referendum, which in any case can only be granted by the British government and on its terms. Support for independence now runs at less than 50%. And when it is explained to my fellow Scots, sorry, when it's explained to my fellow Scots that an independent Scotland would no longer have the pound as its currency, would be outside both the EU and the UK, support falls off dramatically. Besides, the outlook economically for an independent Scotland would be catastrophic. It would have some newfangled currency, no central bank, no reserves, no more huge British subsidies from Westminster. It would have the largest national deficit in Western Europe, a huge slice of the British national debt to pay off, a shrinking tax base, and the prospect of seeing large parts of the country remain in the United Kingdom. This is something that's always overlooked, because if there was a referendum and Scotland, and the Orkneys and Shetlands, and therefore the North Sea, the borders, Edinburgh and parts of the Highlands all voted to remain British, there would be no reason why they shouldn't be allowed to. If Nicola Sturgeon can take Scotland out of Britain, then of course the Orkneys, the Shetlands, the borders, the Highlands, Edinburgh, would all have the right to come out of Scotland and to remain part of Britain. So an independent Scotland, which is unlikely to happen there ever, would probably be a divided Scotland, maybe even half of Scotland. As for Northern Ireland, which is the greatest fiscal deficit of the United Kingdom, and where citizens receive a subsidy from Westminster of £5,000 per head, Union with the Irish Republic would again mean economic catastrophe, not only for Northern Ireland, but Southern Ireland. For the South, it would be the equivalent of West Germany absorbing East Germany, a huge sum of money involved. And absorbing not only it would be absorbing not only Northern Ireland, but with it, a militant terrorist minority, which would probably start a civil war in the island. So no Irish government in its right mind would seriously contemplate the prospect. In any case, support for unification in Northern Ireland is running considerably less than 50%. And although Sinn Féin recently topped the election results for Stormont with 27 seats, this is exactly the same number it got last time in 2017 when it came second. Moreover, the combined number of unionist seats remains higher than the Sinn Féin number, as does the combined unionist vote. The crisis over the protocol is perfectly reasonable. Northern Ireland is economically in the EU, but politically in the United Kingdom. It cannot vote in EU elections to alter its economic circumstances, however. Moreover, the protocol under Article 16 can be suspended if A, there is social, economic, or political unrest, which is already happening, or B, if trade from the UK has been diverted, which again is already happening. So the EU cannot legally enter a trade war or because of what we do about the protocol, which would be perfectly legal. To conclude, therefore, Brexit has a fine world historical pedigree, which I've outlined in terms of the European miracle. But basically, it has involved the return of British sovereignty, allowing Britain to become a self-governing democracy once again, able to make its own way in the world. Economically, Brexit has probably made little difference, but the chief aim was never to achieve greater economic prosperity. The aim was to take back control and to stop paying unelected foreigners to make up stupid laws for us. Despite the wishes of Monsieur Macron, Alistair Campbell, Lord Adonis, Nicola Sturgeon, and all the others, I fear that Brexit is highly unlikely ever to be reversed. Thank you. I'll stop there.